Now, the first session is going to be moderated by Rebecca Shot-Guppy, who is CEO of FinTech Australia. Any FinTechs that are looking to enter the market, we encourage you to connect with Rebecca and her team. The panelists in the first session will be Matt Baxby, Australian CEO for Revolut, Tim Cameron, the Australian New Zealand country manager for Transferwise, and Marie Stein-Thaler, the VP Asia Pacific, TrueLayer. Now we're going to have 20 minutes of panel discussion, or we call it fireside panel discussion, followed by audience Q&A session. You can pose questions to the group by putting comments or questions into the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen. Now I'd like to pass it over to Rebecca. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thanks, John. I'd like to welcome you all again to European FinTechs in Australia, run by InvestVic. I encourage all the guests and attendees to log their questions as we go, so when we do have time to ask the panelists, we have a nice bulk amount of questions and hopefully some hard ones to give them all. I like to get started by asking each of our three panelists to introduce themselves and their company in about 200 words or less.
Shall I kick off?
Yeah, please kick off, Tim.
Hi everyone, my name's Tim Cameron. I work for Transferwise. We're a London headquartered fintech business, and it's our aim to make money move instantly, conveniently and cheaply as possible all around the world. At Transferwise, we've got 7 million customers. We move $7 billion a month for our customers, and most of all, we save our customers over $1.5 billion Australian dollars a year compared to if they use their banks to send money overseas.
Thank you. Marie?
All right, I'll try to count the words as I speak. I look after Asia Pacific for a company called TrueLayer. We are a UK headquartered open banking platform. So what we specialize in is building simple APIs to allow our customers to access banking data and payment rails and embed financial functionality in their applications easily. We are launching in Australia later this year off the back of the consumer data right, and many of our customers actually look at UK and Australia as very complementary regions, and we ourselves are going through this process of establishing in Australia, so excited to be here.
Thanks. And Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, Matt Baxby, I'm the Australian CEO for Revolut. I joined in February, so by Revolut standards, I think that puts me in the veteran status. But yeah, it's been fantastic landing on the ground with Revolut, and I probably don't need to tell too much of the Revolut story, given the audience, other than Revolut globally, 12 million users. Hard to believe it was only 2015 that we launched with a pretty narrow product set, but that's been built out to a whole bunch of adjacencies. And Australia was one of the first expansion markets for Revolut outside the UK and Europe. It's fantastic to be in the local market and hopefully seeing the impact that Revolut can have down here.
Thank you, Matt. And you kind of gave me a great segue for the first question. What attracted you all to set up in Australia? And what are some considerations about setting up in Australia versus other Asia Pacific countries? I might start with you, Matt, because you touched on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think in terms of attractiveness of the market, probably come a couple of things. I think particularly for fintechs, I think the market structure itself is important. There's a high concentration amongst a small number of banks, and so generally consumers are probably pretty light on for choice, and in some ways underserved. I know when I talk to kind of global colleagues, they look at Australia relative to Europe in terms of population density and think, is it a big enough market? But I think what it lacks in population density, it makes up in sort of what I'd call attackable margins. So, the sort of profit pools that are here. I think the other things were, the regulatory regime being fairly familiar and also quite pro-competition. I think that's probably an enduring impact of the Royal Commission that we had in Australia. And then, John touched on it earlier. I think the talent pools are pretty strong, and I've been really impressed in the way we've kind of built the team out with the people we've been able to tap.
Thanks, Matt. I might go to you, Tim. Transferwise has probably been in the market the longest of all the companies on the panel. So what attracted you to the Australian market?
Yeah, I have to agree with everything Matt said. And I think John also touched on the fact that Australia is a country that's quite multicultural. There's a lot of migration to Australia, probably more than, I'd say, UK people would think off the bat. And that diversity and multicultural state here has meant that we have a lot of customers, potential customers, who need to send money overseas. And that, coupled with what Matt said, I guess the attackable margins, so banks in Australia charging the highest fees in the world to send money abroad, meant that there was a really big gap in the market. And yeah, I'd agree with what Matt said about the regulatory landscape, and even just in the payments landscape, the culture around payments or the existing tech stacks, very familiar for customers in the UK and in Australia.
Great. And Marie?
So in addition to what we've heard from Matt and Tim, for us, a big piece was around regulation. As a business, we tend to follow regulation because our industry of open banking, we've just seen the benefits that a well-regulated regime and ecosystem can bring in Europe. And the regulatory push towards the consumer data right in Australia really opened up an opportunity for us, where compared to other regions in APAC, it's much clearer in terms of how we would go about expanding. There is obviously also between the UK and Australia a much closer language and cultural alignment than some of the other markets in APAC, which helps if it's the first market outside of Europe that you're looking at. So I think those, in addition to the points that were already made around, the attackable margins, the market structure. And then also, I think you look at FinTech Australia and the members that you have on board, FinTech is a big market for us, obviously. It's got a vibrant ecosystem that is clearly growing and being supported. There's a minister for it. I think that's something you don't see in many other markets in APAC. So that attracted us.
Thank you. We're very proud of the FinTech ecosystem that we have built here in Australia. We have wonderful engagement across our members, and we have a broad brush of members across all verticals. You also touched on another topic that we'll come back to, CDR. So stay tuned, we'll chat to that in a minute. But I'm slightly biased. I'm a tragic Melburnian. So I'm going to ask Matt and Tim, what attracted you to setting up in Melbourne?
Yeah, I think I'm a parochial Queenslander, so but we've ended up in Melbourne, and I think there's a few reasons for that. One is I think Invest Vic and support the Victorian Government provide is very strong, and it's interesting. We had a launcher that came down to the local market, and I know he speaks very highly of all of the support that was wrapped around him from Invest Victoria, from FinTech Australia. And that's quite important as you sort of navigate through the market. John gave a great summary of some of the other drivers. I think we're in good company in Melbourne, some really strong, technology-based companies that have made real inroads and actually gone global. And then the talent pipeline's obviously a really important one as well. And people say Melbourne's the most European cities. They love that down there, talking about that. Good coffee, all that sort of stuff.
Good coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about you, Tim? You're a Canberrian at heart, so why Melbourne?
Yes, I am Canberran. I've lived in Sydney, I've lived in Melbourne, so I really am Switzerland here. And I actually had the choice to work in Sydney or Melbourne, and I picked Melbourne. Transferwise is very remote friendly. We have our office in Melbourne's kind of grown organically. We've had people on the ground here in Australia since 2016, and we do have our functions split between Melbourne and Sydney. But really, at the end of the day, it was the personal factors that came to play. Melbourne's just, for me, a much more accessible, vibrant city, and I like my coffee and going to the pubs and riding my bike. So Melbourne ticks all those boxes.
Good analysis. I have to admit, I did live in the dark side of Sydney for 8 years, and it was a pretty special time. So I do understand the benefits of both of them, but you are both right on the coffee and the European culture. Something that we've talked about a lot over the last six weeks, 3 months has been the impact of COVID on fintech businesses. We've seen some businesses thrive, indebted being some, and some of them thrive based on their digital offerings. And then others have had huge struggles in relation to capital raising and B2B sales. But what challenges and opportunities has COVID-19 presented all of your businesses?
I might jump and take this one briefly. So we are a technology platform that we see a lot of use cases around digitizing processes that otherwise need bank statements or even, in the dark old ages, physical interaction. I think it's been very clear that those types of use cases are just taking off. So digital identity verification of income, things like that are just moving more towards the digital, and we're seeing a lot of interest from players who are trying to now use this as an opportunity to improve their processes. You mentioned indebted. I think in the credit space, the shift has been more towards how do we deal with customers once we've extended them a loan? How do we deal with collections and managing of the ongoing customer relationship, where again our banking data feeds become more important for the ongoing early warning signs, finding out whether someone's about to default, etc. And then I think the other one for us, as we're expanding into APAC, we're still a very lean team out here, and the fact that everyone's more used to digital communications has made a lot of our client conversations much easier, and has actually put us more on par with the HQ, because now suddenly everyone's working remotely. So people realize that, it's actually useful to write things down and not just talk about it in the kitchen when you're around other people. So, and a lot of our clients have echoed that. So I think it's making global expansion easier because everyone's in the same boat.
Perfect. And Tim?
Yeah, I think echoing what Marie said, I think we've seen this shift to digital being the silver lining in what's otherwise been a very hard time for a lot of people. At Transferwise, we've been fully digital since we started nearly a decade ago. So we were well set up to weather this, and we're quite proud to say we've been able to keep serving our customers with full staffing, and our transfer volumes have been healthy throughout this time. But yeah, it has been a tough, you'd know better than anyone probably, Beck. There's been a lot of heartache, especially for smaller players. People who are just trying to get capital raises and stuff off the ground. They're the ones who've really suffered. So if you have a healthy balance sheet, there's definitely opportunities.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting time. I think that a lot of our members with a lot of runway have done very well, but the smaller ones, and particularly the small business lenders that haven't been able to access any support from the government, have also struggled. But then we've seen, obviously, some companies do very well out of it as well. And that, let me throw to Matt for any final comments in that space.
Yeah, I think the way I sort of think about it is sort of two dimensions. I think there's the short-term one, which is a bit of what Tim, you just mentioned, and Rebecca, you built on, which was sort of, it's almost the dislocation as a test of resilience. I think FinTech Australia has done fantastic work lobbying the government for the right level of support, and the way they've responded, I think, is sort of indicative of how they see FinTech and the importance of it. So things like, subsidies for those that are pre-revenue, and there's a whole lot of discussions happening there. I think the bigger long-term impact, though, is what Marie mentioned, which is sort of the digitization of Australian lives. And if anything, that I think COVID's accelerated that, and the net winners of that should be FinTech rather than the incumbents, because they'll be slower to respond. They got more legacy, more tech debt to sort of climb over. So I think if we can kind of weather the short-term storm, Revolut's really fortunate. We closed a really big fundraising before COVID, so it did give us that runway. But I'm probably even more bullish on the opportunity in the local market because of those kind of long-term enduring impacts of acceleration of disruption in business models.
And a really basic example of something that's changed overnight from COVID in Australia has been even the ability to sign deeds digitally. It's taken about 20 years to get that, but the ability for the governments across the board to introduce that is a sign that we are progressing to that digital economy in that digital way. Which leads me to a little bit more of a deeper conversation. Next week's session InvestVic are running is in relation to, and they've got the regulator ASIC on board. Tim and Matt more particularly, do you have any tips or advice when engaging with the regulator, the local regulator here, and any insights would be appreciated.
Yeah, I can kick that one off. I think for UK companies that have got traction in the UK, I think you can actually bring a really important lens to the way regulation is evolving in Australia. There are some big initiatives in the work that have been put on pause, but looking into how stored value, like electronic money products, are going to be regulated in the future. And because the ecosystem is a bit smaller, I've been very positively surprised with the levels of engagement I've gotten with regulators when I want to show them how we do things, how Transferwise has done things in the UK, and why that might be the right way to perhaps modify things here in Australia. So I think one thing is don't be afraid of trying to pitch your ideas to the regulator. Most of the time they will be ready to listen, especially if you've got something you can show them that works well for both businesses and consumers alike in the UK.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think I 100% agree, and I think early engagement with the regulators is really, really critical in terms of building a bit of credibility, but also your own understanding of the local market. Because I think that's probably the other element, is to demonstrate that you understand what the local market regulations are. Because if you come back to kind of what their role is, it's protecting deposit holders or primacy of customers, and so you need to demonstrate that you're able to sort of wrap your arms around that. Revolut's found it important, and it sounds like the other panelists have had a similar experience, that putting people on the ground who know the local market has been quite important.
Thank you. And another thing that we've been told constantly is early engagement. The earlier that you engage with them, the better the outcome. And that's something that FinTech Australia and Invest can facilitate. So if you are interested in entering the local market, FinTech Australia can help you connect with the regulator and make it a little bit easier for you. I'm going to go to Marie now. You were the first European company to announce that your expansion into Australia for open banking. What are your views on the consumer data right in Australia, and how does it differ from other international schemes, and what opportunities do you think it will open for fintechs in the market?
Great question. So at a high level, I think what really attracted us to the CDR, which is short for consumer data right, is that it's, unlike in Europe, not coming out of payment regulation, but actually was set with a much broader remit in mind. So it starts with banking, but it's really intended to be a sector, cross-sector spanning right for consumers to own and share and access their data in a programmatic way. And that, for us as a business, we started in the financial services space, and that's very much our focus. Banking data is our focus, but it gives us the opportunity to at least see a path to experimenting with additional sectors and thinking about what could almost like a marriage of banking data with utility data and telco data look like in terms of unlocking new services. And if I look at, for instance, some of the work that Australian companies like 86400 and some of these players are doing around utility switching, which is somewhat similar to some of the initiatives in Europe from the likes of Monzo, and I'm sure others in this room are probably thinking about similar things. I think it's just interesting to see how that will pan out. And so as a market I heard at some point that Australia is the only country in the world where McDonald's uses a different brand name and tries new concepts. And I think there's probably a reason for that. It's a great place to try things. Tim mentioned the diversity and kind of the many different groups and demographics that exist to try out new things. So that was a big piece for us. So back to the consumer data right, I think it's the ambition of the project in going beyond just banking data that was exciting for us. And then I think in terms of why for us as a UK-based company it was interesting, it's quite similar to in some sense quite similar to open banking in the UK. There are some key differences, which are more around how the regulatory model works, which right now, as an example, you do have, it's kind of described as a closed loop system. So you have to be accredited to access the data. Whereas in Europe, there are models that are more like an agency model where you have a principal and an entity with the regulatory license can help others to try it out before having to get fully accredited in their own right. So some of those sort of very technical details, I think it will force us as a platform to think about different paradigms and make us stronger. And I think any UK business thinking about expanding to Australia, you will get a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of similarities, while also making the business stronger in terms of preparing for new paradigms.
Thank you, Marie. And for all of those on the call, the Consumer Data Right actually launches next Wednesday, 1 July, which is a very exciting day. And we also got new legislation out this week in relation to having that kind of agency principal model. So hopefully we see that evolve going forward. I'm going to ask one more question before I throw to the attendees questions. Have any of you got any tips or advice for any companies looking to enter the Australian market?
You already gave my tip, Beck, which is talk to and Beck, or someone in Beck's team. I think this ecosystem is a lot smaller than in the UK. I have found it to be quite welcoming. And if there's anyone on the call that wants to talk payments or e-money, feel free to get in touch with me as well.
Thanks, Tim. Matt?
I was just going to add, I think I sort of made the point earlier, understanding the nuances of the local market, I think is really important. So investing that time, it's so easy, particularly if you're coming from a global, to assume that the kind of conditions that worked and were successful there are going to be directly applicable. And in a lot of cases that's the case, but in others there is some market adaptation that's required, and it's everything from tone of voice to way product features work, the competitive environment. My piece of advice would, put the time in, build the relationships, understand the local market, and I think the prospect of success is going to be higher.
Thank you. And Marie, last but not least.
Yeah, I would agree with both points so far. Like, sweating the detail, I think is important. And the best way to do that is, you can do a lot of desk research, but having a conversation with a handful of people who you maybe get to know through FinTech Australia or through Invest Victoria, I think that really goes a long way to getting a real grasp for what it's like on the ground. Because that's definitely something I found. I did a lot of desk research, and that tells you one story, and then you go and talk to people like yourself, and you realize, oh, there's all this nuance I didn't realize, and how can I now get to the next level of understanding? And it doesn't have to take a long time. It's just a question of, scheduling those calls and being really open about what you're trying to achieve, and people are very friendly and willing to help.
That's definitely something I've noticed. Everyone's willing to catch up with each other and have a coffee, which is always greatly appreciated. We've had our first question come in, and I think it's targeted slightly towards you, Matt. In the UK, they've seen 25% of customers open up a Challenger bank account. How long do you think it will be before we see such dramatic shift in consumer behaviour in Australia?
Yeah, I'd like to think we're right at the fork in the road on this, because if you think about some of the things that in Australia that have kept the incumbents with the market structure that they've had and kept them as incumbents, I think, there's been an erosion of trust. And I think fundamentally digital business models accelerating for some of the things we talked about earlier. And I think the big question would be, one, their ability to adapt, but secondly, how quickly new entrants can come in and sort of fill that space. And we've seen, the neobanks in Australia come to market and have some impact. I think, it's demonstrated that there's real appetite amongst consumers for, some alternatives. So I think, UK is a great market for us to look at to say, what's the direction of travel for Australia? Because, lots of the things that have encouraged competition in the UK have sort of arrived here. Open banking's one, a pro-competition government, a developing fintech ecosystem. So I really hope we're at a point where we can put the foot down, and it's really about being clear as the problem you're trying to solve in the local market, how you're going to address that. Aussies are pretty discerning. I think Marie made the point, lots of companies use Australia as a bit of a test bed because consumers are pretty discerning. So if you can make the concept work here, it probably has a bit of global scale. But yeah, I'm really optimistic that we're at that sort of fork in the road, and consumers are going to go in the right direction.
On that note, do you think that it will take challenger banks to widen their product offering, what is currently offered, to a range of suite of products to get consumers to switch, or do you think it's just a matter of time? Anyway.
Yeah, I think breadth of offering is really important, but it's got to be combined with clarity around the problem, the need that's being met. So I think just taking an existing business model, sticking it on some new tech, tossing that into the market isn't going to be enough. I think I think the winners will be the ones that can genuinely identify the problem to be solved and sort of meet the market in a way that's easy to use and seamless and quite a different experience to what consumers have been used to with banks in Australia in the past.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to the next question. How has your experience been dealing with local incumbents, either as competitors or partners? I may go to Marie to kick us off with this one, and then we might speak to Tim about it.
Interesting question. So I would say, in the open banking space, any country we look at that has some level of maturity on the idea of sharing data via APIs will have locally specialized competitors. The oldest incumbents we're really looking at in our space are maybe 20 years old, which is like pretty old, but it's not that old. And their technology paradigm that they use is often quite different. So I would say the experience there has been like cautious curiosity. People are open to chatting. It's always a difference between interacting with the entity as like, hey, we are TrueLayer and you are company X. How do we potentially partner or work together? In general, in our industry, it's I think a very collaborative. Or everyone could be a partner or could be a competitor. So that's been good in terms of the individuals in the company. I think there's been a lot more. It's been pretty positive in that there are, even in some of our very clear competitors, just individuals who are interested in learning what we're doing. And I think there's always a kind of, I'll talk to you, I'll tell you just about enough, and you'll tell me just about enough. And ultimately, we're still in the stage where it's about building the ecosystem as a whole. I think that the mistake we could make now is treat it very much like a zero-sum game where it's, I can only win by taking business from you. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Right now, it's about, rising tide lifting all boats. And I think everyone locally kind of feels, or I hope everyone feels the same way. There's probably a few companies who are more fearful than others, but generally it's been very positive.
Well, I think the stats are for the ecosystem, 80% of Australian fintechs get their customers from incumbents. So it is a lot about collaboration. There will be fintechs in the market that do disrupt the incumbents, but it is a lot about collaboration and community. Yeah. Did Tim or Matt, do you have any insights into that topic?
There are some local, I'd say, competitors or incumbents that we would wish that they would be more open to working with us. And we do think part of the reason they're not particularly keen to work with us is we're taking their lunch and giving a lot of that back to their customers. So there is that. On the positive side, there are a lot of like local firms. Even in Melbourne, we have an integration in the works with Up Bank. We have partnered with Go Cardless globally. Their Australia HQs in Melbourne, and we have stuff in the works with Xero in UK, and their global HQ is in Melbourne. So there are lots of exciting things happening, and a lot of local success stories, and a lot of partners to work with.
Great.
Rebecca, I was probably only going to add. I think in the last 5 years or so, I think it's almost matured from fintechs are going to eat our lunch to there's potentially real value for incumbents in working more closely with fintech. So if you think about access to customers that they wouldn't otherwise access themselves, a bit of a philosophy that if we don't open our minds to working with them, the reality is they're going to find someone else to work with. And the third is that probably a sense that they can actually learn something from fintech. So that's whether it's a different way of working, you know, where the agility comes from, a different mindset around, you know, addressing a customer need. So I've seen that, and probably coming, you know, my last role came out of traditional banking, so I sort of saw the mindset shift in real time, and then being on the other side, you know, I've been buoyed by, you know, my experience in partners being pretty open to working with us.
Thank you, Matt. I think the old saying is it's easier to build from outside in than inside out. And I think Apple's the greatest example of that. So I think that mindset has definitely switched in Australia for incumbents. Another question we have from the audience is, all panelists have existing offerings overseas. What were the biggest things that needed to change to suit the local market? I might actually kick off with Matt on this one.
Yeah, I think probably made a few of the points. I think, yeah, that understanding of the local context, the importance of having people on the ground who understand that, and then a number of aspects are more than just the consumer offering. So if you take something like FinCrime or AML CTF, I think, you know, I think we worked pretty hard to ensure that we kind of leverage the global technology that Revolut's got access to, but obviously invested the time to localize that for what the regulatory environment is, but still managed to develop a really great customer experience off the back of it. So I think that's not an obvious kind of product shift that we made, but I think is an example of, you know, the kind of globalization, taking a kind of global feature or technology, adapting it for the local market in terms of the regulatory environment, but preserving a customer experience on the way through there.
Is there a change in marketing your product? I know in the UK that you got a lot of adoption through word of mouth and particular industries. Is there a change in strategy in relation to marketing?
No, I think the network effect is critical, and having things like peer-to-peer features a really important part of that. I think also a build out of the feature set, so use cases building out beyond just, you know, something fairly narrow around travel, given the conditions we're in, to really putting the foot down on the build out of more features that increase the addressable market, identify what the needs in the local market are, and deliver to those. Great.
And Tim, have you guys pivoted in any way to suit the local market?
Yeah, I think Matt's point around local AML CTF is definitely going to be an investment, and you'll need to make in your Australian, at least the back end. Customers won't see much of that. So we do have to ask Australian customers a few additional data points compared to everywhere else in the world. Some other features that are Australian specific that we've introduced in Australia are the ability to pay by poly. How to describe it to Brits? It's kind of like what open banking will do in the future, but it's a scrappier version, and it's a typical way that Australians would have paid for flights or medium to higher value ticket-sized items in the past. So yeah, that was something our customers asked for, and we worked with local partners here on the ground to implement that for them.
Thank you. And Marie, have you, obviously the change in CDR rules, have you guys had to make any
adaptations? Yeah, I would say in any case, we always strive to be locally regulated wherever we go, because we think it builds trust, and it's something we're very used to from Europe. So in that sense, yes, we're having to adapt to what the local obligations are, but actually a lot of the principles are the same. It's about having a fit and proper person in place. It's about having good governance. It's about having the right insurance and complaints procedure, etc. So it's very much what we're used to from the UK. I think big one actually it's all the boring stuff around group structure, entity structure, which entity actually goes for the accreditation, how does the intra-group management of data and infrastructure and IP work. So I think that those are some of the most costly and frustrating things, which ultimately the customer never sees, and you're not necessarily building customer value during that time or with that work, but it's really necessary. And that's, I think, something where, you know, if you work in a business that has the ability to work through some kind of, whether it's a fintech bridge or some sort of trial program to try and validate the customer proposition before you go through all that work, that's wonderful. We're not in a position to be able to do that unless we reverted to different technology, which as a company we're not willing to do. So I think that's the big one. It's all the boring stuff. And then I'm sure as we launch and build out the product, there will be specific things for Australia that we realize from clients who give us a shot early on, where they're like, oh, but this works, you know, differently in Australia than it does in the UK. And then we'll just have to ship very quickly to make the product work.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question before we hand back over to the Invest Victoria team. And I think it's a really relevant question given COVID. For new entrants, do you think the closed borders of Australia will be a significant obstacle, or will virtually hiring and scaling teams become the norm? I know I'm a bit up in the air if people are going to want to go back in the office or not. So I'm keen to hear your views and get your thoughts on that.
Do you want me to kick it off?
Yeah. Why not? Or in a bit of outer space. So
yeah, exactly. No, in terms of the position Revolut in Australia is in, we're in sort of scale the team up mode, and in some ways, you'd think COVID would be a big barrier to that. And early on, I think we found people's willingness to think about a job change at the time there's so much disruption probably wasn't helpful. But through the period, it seems to have normalized a bit. And three of my senior hires, fantastic people, I've never met them in person. So we've gone from screen call through our home tasks, through the interview processes, met a lot of people in our HQ, and they've now landed in the team. One of them's in a different city, but it all seems to be working really well. I think the teams come together and there's good cohesiveness and really focused on what we're trying to get done. I think in terms of, I think it will accelerate the shift to, and I think we've all touched on the fact that the companies we work for are pretty open to remote working, and they're, the tech all works, so it's been pretty seamless. But I think people's own mindsets have shifted a little bit. I know when we've done kind of surveys globally, there's real desire to extend the amount of time working from home, and I think that's partly a response of it's worked pretty well. I'm still getting things done. I've got an hour at the end of each day back, and I'm able to sort of focus on task a little bit more. I think then you're just trading some of the social aspects and probably a little bit of ideation and the like. But it's been a really interesting sort of social experiment. I think particularly on the hiring side.
I can also relate, particularly in relation to the team balance. My manager team, that's all remote, and my team this week went back to the office in Sydney 2 days a week and 3 days at home because they all enjoyed the balance, but then also missed the social aspect. Tim, do you have anything to add on to what Matt and I have just...
Not a lot. Matt's covered most of it. I do think that companies that have a strong documentation and the ability to brainstorm, as Matt said, they're the two big things that you might otherwise miss, the communication and the brainstorming. So I think, we'll try and chip away at those things here at Transferwise, so we don't lose those aspects. But we're pretty natural. Working from home is pretty natural for us, and we went 100% working from home very early, and that's the way it's staying for the time being.
Same for us. I think we're on week 15. Last but not least, Marie.
I would say that the time we spend, I think there's there will be in the future many, many more companies who work fully distributed. And I think that the average company will probably improve through that, because you'll be more thoughtful about documenting, writing out your thoughts, which is much harder than riffing in front of a whiteboard. So I think the average company will probably improve through that. I think there will be at the very cutting edge of trying to do things that are high bandwidth and low latency, real gains to being in the same place. And I think there we will probably see, you know, if I think about a TrueLayer, we're going back to making the option available to go back to our offices in the UK from next week. I think we'll see people being much more deliberate about, those are the 2 days I'm in the office and I have a very clear goal. I want to meet with these people, do some really high bandwidth work with this outcome in mind, and get some socializing in. And I think that will really reap rewards compared to being 100% distributed. You know, we're a small team here in APAC. We in any case have that issue already, even without COVID, of having to figure out how to do that with a team that's distributed across the globe.
Thank you. And I do know one of our members in Australia recently hired their first employee in Tasmania and their first employee in Darwin, and they're a Melbourne headquartered company. So it has already changed the hiring processes of some of our local members. I want to thank all the panelists for their time this evening. Normally I'd ask the audience to give them a round of applause, but it's a bit hard virtually. So on behalf of FinTech Australia and Invest Victoria, I would like to thank you all for giving up your Thursday evening and for sharing some insights on expanding into the Australian market. For those that are online, please feel free to reach out to FinTech Australia. We're always willing to give up our time to help any international businesses looking to launch in the market. In addition, FinTech Australia runs Intersect, which is the largest FinTech conference, which all three have had the pleasure of attending before. It will probably most likely run virtually this year in a hybrid model, 26th, 27th of October, but please join us for Intersect, or feel free to reach out. But thank you all again to all our panelists. And I'll throw back to John.
Thanks, Beck, and thanks everyone for that panel discussion. That was fantastic. And Matt, if I can find that 1 hour that you said you've won back, I'll be glad. I think I've just consumed more time on remote working. An important issue, as was highlighted before, was around talent. And what we decided to do here is to introduce you to Nedra Kalat and Charlotte Stevenson from the Department of Home Affairs, who are going to quickly give a discussion on the global talent visa. If I can now pass it over to Charlotte and Nedra, please.
Thanks, John. And I'd like to thank Invest Victoria for having us on this session tonight. My name is Nedra Kalat, and I'm a Global Talent Officer with the Department of Home Affairs with responsibility for the ASEAN region. And I have with me Charlotte, who is also a Global Talent Officer with responsibility for Europe, UK, and Israel. We do have a short slide deck that we'd like to share with you now, and I'm hoping that you can all see it on your screens. Just give us a moment. Yep, I'm hoping everyone can see that. So I'm sure some of you are wondering what the Department of Home Affairs has in common with the FinTech sector, and let me tell you that we have an exciting proposition for you. In November last year, the federal government officially launched Australia's Global Talent Visa Program, a program that provides a streamlined priority visa pathway for extremely talented or highly skilled professionals, entrepreneurs, inventors across priority growth sectors, including FinTech, the opportunity to live and work permanently in Australia. If we turn back or turn our attention to last week's session, we had Alan Sen of FinTech Australia, who spoke about talent recruitment being a pressure point for the fintech sector. And we also spoke about the importance of having boots on the ground. The federal government is very invested in the fintech sector. And this program is a commitment to ensure that we get those boots on the ground. We have limited time today, so I won't go into detail, but I do want to touch on the benefits and the requirements for this visa pathway. And I'll hand over to Charlotte, who will take you through a success story of a fintech professional that she helped through this visa pathway and some of the opportunities that this visa pathway has to offer. So moving on to the benefits, as I'd mentioned previously, it does offer a streamlined priority visa pathway. And what this means is that it's streamlined because the requirements are simple and straightforward. And I'll touch on the requirements in the next slide. And it's also a priority visa pathway. And what this means is that compared to some of our other skilled visa pathways, you don't have to wait as long to be granted a visa. The other benefit is that it offers PR on ground for the applicant and dependent family, which means that there is no waiting period. You can live and work anywhere in Australia, and this is an interesting point, particularly for those fintech specialists out there who want to flock to Melbourne, being the fintech capital of Australia. You won't have any restrictions on your visa preventing you from doing that. There's also no age limit with this visa pathway, and what that means is that the Global Talent Program uses which visa? Sorry.
The Distinguished Talent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Distinguished Talent Visa, which is flexible enough to allow individuals over the age of 45 years to apply for this visa. The other benefit, of course, is that there is no occupation list restrictions that you need to align with, and it's open more broadly to the fintech sector. Moving on to the requirements, as I mentioned, it's streamlined. So you have to align to one of 7 priority growth sectors, and fintech obviously is one of those growth sectors, which means for fintech professionals, you've already ticked the box here. You need to be internationally recognized and exceptionally talented, and the website has more information on how you can meet this particular criteria. The other requirement is that you have to be nominated, and that means be endorsed. Your credentials have to be endorsed by an Australian organization or individual who is in the same field as the applicant. And the final requirement is the ability to meet the Fair Work High Income threshold, which is currently set at 148,700 Australian dollars. Again, there's information on the website, and what this requirement is, it highlights your ability to meet the threshold, and there are a number of ways that we can work around that requirement. So as I said, the features are quite significant. The requirements are quite simple and straightforward. So we're hoping that this is going to be a visa pathway that many of our fintech professionals who want to move over are going to be able to apply and be successful through. I'm going to pass over to Charlotte to take you through the success story, and then we might come back to some questions depending on the time we have left.
Thanks, Nidra. So we thought, because we don't have a huge amount of time today, that one of the best ways to kind of demonstrate the benefits of the program was to highlight one of our success stories. So I'm the Global Talent Officer for UK, Europe and Israel, and up until recently was actually located in Europe. one of the first people that I engaged with and I put through the program was a man called Will Banks, based in the UK. He's a fintech specialist with over 20 years experience in the sector, and his vision was to create a new product disruptive neobank in Australia. Because of his age, and he would hate for me to say this online, but he's over 45, he wouldn't have actually been eligible for permanent residence under any of our other visa programs. And so he was eligible for the Global Talent Program because he met all of the requirements that Nidra just mentioned. And so he was actually granted permanent residence within 3 weeks of putting his application in. So even though these processes are likely to be a bit longer because of COVID, I think that his case really highlights the Australian government's emphasis on attracting fintech innovators into Australia. The program is also not just for people currently outside Australia. If you've got talent in Australia that you're looking to retain, they might be on temporary visas. It's also a way of incentivising them to stay in the country and keep them within your startup or your scale up. So Mr. Banks arrived about a month ago in Australia. He's already working with banks, the big banks, and working with relevant stakeholders to get his business kick-started. He's also put 2 of his other executives through the program, which is great. So it's not just about the visa though. I'll very quickly just highlight this because I think it was raised by the panel and they really touched on this. I also put him in touch with a lot of different contacts in Australia before he arrived and also after he arrived. And that was really important for him to have the best chance of success. So I put him in touch with relevant government officials, with industry leaders, and he really took advantage of the FinTech Bridge, which was great. And I guess to wrap up, because I know we're kind of running out of time, this is really just one of the success stories that we've had. So we know that, you know, distance, visas, they're both a big thing for someone jumping into the Australian market. So we think this program is really something the government is investing in and highlighting to try and both retain talent, but also bring talent into the country. So I think we're probably running out of time, but what I will do is I'll just quickly flick up our contact details. So I know that we've really rushed through everything, but if you've got any questions at all, you're interested in the program, you'd like to know more, if you know people, that would also be great, who could be candidates for the program. You can see our LinkedIn handles just there, and you can email us or go to our website. Any of those would be great, and we're more than happy to chat, to meet up with people virtually, obviously. Yeah, but I might just quickly check how we're going for time and see whether we perhaps have any questions or whether we might actually have to wrap up.
I think we're probably running out of time, and what can happen here is we can take questions on notice. And I think you've given the details there, which is great. That's an exciting development. So I think that is. Thank you everyone for the panel discussions, for this panel discussion. Thanks Rebecca for hosting that. Nedra and Charlotte, thank you very much. Look, I'd just like to leave a couple of I've written down a couple of quotes here by some of the panelists. And Tim said, regulators are willing to listen, which I think is a strength. Marie said, great place to try things, which is, I think, is a strength down here. And Matt says there's a real appetite by consumers for change. So you have a really prospective market here in Australia. And on that point, Rebecca, I think importantly, said the CDR regulation is going to be released next Wednesday, which is a real important inflection point in our market here. So the next session we have is next Thursday, the 2nd of July, and it's a chance to meet the regulators, ASIC, which I think is a very important part if you're trying to set up in Australia, is knowing the local regulations. So I'd be really encouraging you to come along to listen to that session. I think that's it. I should say, just visit our website on investvictoria.com, or follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Good night, good evening, good morning.